to CivilNet. My guest today from Doha is Salman Shaikh, who is the director of the Brookings Doha Center. Salman, thank you for joining us on CivilNet.
It's my great pleasure to join you.
Salman, you are someone who's been involved in peace processes. You're in Doha, which means you're at the center of processes that affect the Arab world, that therefore affect the rest of the world. And today, of course, we're going to talk about Syria because everyone's talking about Syria. And even at Brookings in Washington, for example, today, there's a discussion about strike, not to strike, and then what happens. Do you find that it's hard to insert the Arab perspective into the American or Western psyche?
Well, yes, it is. I mean, of course, after nearly 2.5 years, it seems as if the American public is now really waking up to what is going on in Syria and the dangers of what's going on in Syria. But as you say, it's very much a domestically driven debate by a US president who really hasn't prepared his people, in my view, for what is now coming next and what are the tough choices that he faces. It's very good that the United States are having this debate, but of course Arab publics and Arab audiences have been watching and been consumed, and of course particularly Syrians and those immediately around them who are affected, such as the Lebanese or the Jordanians or the Turks or the Iraqis or even the Israelis. They have been consumed now by this conflict, which has just gone from bad to worse.
And the conflict is consuming, of course, not just the neighbors, but all of the pieces of Syria. I don't want to use the word sects because it's beyond that. All of the pieces in Syria. And at the end of the day, it seems no one in the Middle East and no one in the West has any sort of consensus.
Well, that's right. I mean, I would call them communities, communities or constituencies, which are different. Absolutely right. I'm afraid we have got away from first really understanding what is the nature of Syrian society. How is it organized? Who are the main influential poles of this society? Who are the positive forces within the society? And of course, it's been easy to do so as we've seen the carnage and as we've seen Syrian society being torn apart by the conflict. But I think we have to go back to that understanding and developing a deeper understanding of Syrian society. It's wonderful mosaic, it's different communities, it's regionalisms, it's localisms, and then see how those actually fitted together and have fitted together in the past, especially as we now urgently think about how we move forward, how we think about an alternative to the Assad regime.
You used a very interesting term that I haven't heard anyone use. We've spoken to various experts on Syria. Of course, we speak to Armenians in and from Syria. And nobody has talked about positive forces. Are there? Who are they? Do they evolve?
Well, they are Syrians. That's the positive force. Syrians are Syrians first, even if they are from different backgrounds and different communities. That is, first and foremost, the positive force which we forget. And, you know, we've heard from Syrians of all backgrounds, from all communities, who have expressed a wish to engage and discuss the future of their country in terms which I think many Syrians would understand, and which we've not really heard amplified, particularly in the international debate. Unfortunately, that positive force has been subdued by the narratives which have taken over, one of sectarianism and of competition, of regional competition and everything else that goes with it. That positive force is actually probably the majority of Syrians, particularly those in the influential areas of the cities, the main cities, the majority grey area, which is the positive force. We have not given it enough support. The international community has not given it enough support. It's not understood it enough, in my view. And now there is an urgent need for us to focus on how we can support and give real credence to those, in my view, majority Syrian positive forces.
Except they are the majority Syrian positive forces without any levers of power, it seems. In your former life, you've worked on the Middle East peace process, which means Israel and Palestine and the countries around. You were involved in the 2006 Lebanese war discourse. How can one talk about peace in the Middle East? Where is that little key, the little keyhole, the little entry point, specifically in this case now?
Well, specifically in the case of Syria, as I said, we have to look at Syrian society. We have to look at what are poles of influence within Syrian society. What are the poles of influence within the Armenian community, the Christian community more broadly, within the Alawi community, within the Sunni community, the Druze. And I'm not dividing it up in sectarian terms. I'm just looking at the mosaic of Syrian society. And in our discussions with them, with these communities, and by the way, let me also say we have to look at where are the poles of influence within the economic and business community, within the religious community, within the tribal elements and leaderships that there are. And across the board, what we have found is that if you listen to them, they are thinking still as Syrians first, even though they have become, many of them, increasingly fearful of what is happening in their country. And in my view, a path towards peace, a path towards a political solution, is to hear the interests of and the fears and concerns of all of those constituencies, and then get Syrians, as Syrians first, to negotiate those interests, whether it's to do with arrangements for security and their protection, whether it's to do with the economic and governance side, whether it's to do with issues to do with land and property rights. And it's only when we get those discussions going between Syrians that we may well be able to arrive at a blueprint which gives people a lot more confidence about the future than they have today. And that's urgent now.
You're speaking in terms that don't add up to a zero-sum game, and yet the discourse in newspapers, on television, in and out of the Arab world is, can simply be described as people throwing their hands up in the air and saying, can't do anything. Is this the rock bottom, and is there a way to come out of this towards an environment that you're describing?
Of course, there is a way out of this in the way that I'm describing, but I fear that we've not actually reached rock bottom. 1,000 people killed here or 100 people killed every day, areas and communities being victimized, it seems for us not to have reached there. We still have this competition between great powers and between regional powers, which is something that we've got to move beyond. And we can only do it, as I said, if we focus on a Syrian-led process and we give Syrians the ability to do that, all Syrians, rather than any particularly narrow constituency. I fear, though, that in the phase ahead, if we haven't learned the lessons yet, it's actually going to get much worse before it gets better. I hate to say that because people have been saying this now for the last 30 months. I hope that, though, that people start to understand this. And on the margins, in our discussions with the American administration, in even trying to reach out and with the Europeans and with particular Arab regional players, there is now some understanding of this. And I hope that this will go further. It will go further in terms of a discussion with the Russian government, with those in the non-aligned movement, with those in the BRICS, such as in China or in terms of India or South Africa, all of whom can play an important role in a diplomatic and a political solution. I hope that understanding really takes hold. Unfortunately, we don't have a champion yet in the international community that can help Syrians in this particular quest to get away from, as you say, that zero-sum game, where I still believe, of course, that Assad and his regime have to go, but where that's not enough, where we have to fashion an alternative, as I've said before, which gives confidence to both Syrians as well as those on the outside who want to support them.
Just in conclusion, it seems that this rational approach that you're advocating, that of course only makes sense, but it's up against all of the unethical events that are happening. I don't know if there is ethics in war, but this particularly drastic, desperate level of destruction that's taking place, so that even that potential champion or champions doesn't really seem to have a leg to stand on. I mean, there's rationality versus this terrible destruction. And where do they walk into this argument, discussion? Is there space for them?
Of course there is, because it's not just about rationality, it's not just about what some may perceive as idealism. No, it's about pursuing the right strategy, the right practical strategy. It's something that I've been speaking about when it comes to this debate in the United States right now. You need a strategy, in my view, which is military, but also diplomatic and political. On the military side, and let me say this, unfortunately, the Assad regime has only shown that it will use more and more force to subdue those people, and I believe they are the majority, who want change in their country. But that cannot be done in isolation to a diplomatic strategy which tries to build an ever greater consensus for change. And it still seems that we don't have that within, certainly not the Security Council, but in a broader community of nations. But beyond that, we need a political strategy, is the one that I've pointed out, whereby which we promote an intra-Syrian dialogue, an intra-Syrian reconciliation process, which brings together, if possible, all of Syria's communities. An effort has been made with regards to the Syrian opposition coalition, but so far it has failed in terms of really creating the impetus for that, which is where, again, I've said, the international community actually has a role to play. And I would say that the United Nations has not done enough in creating that legitimate, safe space whereby which Syrians can come together and to discuss without fear of being detained, without fear of being killed. We are now in a situation whereby which Martin Dempsey, the American Chief of Armed Services, summed up, where we are in a situation where on the one side we have a regime which is gassing its people, and an alternative which not everyone is comfortable with, including in Syria itself, which is why it is imperative we, in my view, move as fast as we can, not just on the military side of things, but also with regards to really promoting an intra-Syrian dialogue. I think far too much time has also been spent on hoping that the Russians and the Americans can somehow forge an understanding and an agreement and then impose it on Syrians themselves. Put simply, I don't believe the regime, Assad regime, is going to negotiate away its power, and the opposition is still too divided, really, to come up with a common position. So we have to focus, in my view, in a different tact. And practically speaking, this is where the international community, I think, has to give a lot more weight and support, and to try to create that legitimate space whereby which Syrians can discuss and dialogue amongst themselves, with the help, of course, of the international community, especially in the aftermath of all of this. The other thing I would say, it is absolutely essential, in my view, that the Syrian Christian community engages in this dialogue. The Christian community has undertaken great sacrifices inside Syria. It's wrong to say that it has been supporting the regime or it's all been supporting the opposition. We know, of course, that many Syrian Christians just want the best for their country. But now is the time, in that regard, in my view, that empowered Christian leaders step forward and be part of that dialogue. A dialogue which I believe would inevitably start to happen, whether it's a month from now or a year from now. In the end, this is where the solution lies.
Well, I'm not supposed to comment, but let me comment. My grandmother, born in Syria, would have said, "May God hear your voice." And I would like to add, may a few others hear your voice as well. Thank you so much for trying to bring some sense to what seems to be such an unsensible, irrational situation.
It is, and I hope and pray for all of Syria's communities and for Syrians that we do get to a point whereby which, we can move on. My wife is Christian, by the way, and I believe passionately that a Middle East, a Syria, without the Christian community, the oldest community, is not the Middle East that we know. And I hope we all see sense and get beyond what the period we're in right now, and across the region.
Absolutely. Thank you. We've been speaking with Salman Shaikh, who is director of the Brookings Doha Center, is in Doha, and is helping us try to make sense of a very difficult situation on Syria. And thank you for following us on CivilNet.